Hey guys, how you doing? This is Mr. Lou, and this is my time-lapse painting of Johnny Depp. I'm going to try to give you guys as many pointers as possible. This painting took me about a total of 4.5 hours over the course of a few days. It's sped up to 20 times the speed. Before I start painting, I mix up the colors to get the skin tone. I'm not too worried about getting the exact tone because all of that can be adjusted later. I use a lot of water, a lot of yellow, a little bit of red, and touches of blue. His photo has a very warm tone to it, so I aim to get an orange skin tone. At this phase in the painting, I'm also looking to see if there are any cool colors anywhere on his face and make a mental note of that. In this particular photo, it's not very apparent, but there are hints of cool colors, like parts of the shadows have some purples, under his eyes there are hints of a bluish tone. I get his entire face wet with plain water, then apply the color mixture I just made. This does a few things. One, it lightens up the values, so if there are any mistakes early on, I'm able to just blot at it and make it go away completely. Keeping your paper wet also makes it easier to blend smoothly. After I lay down the base value, I go back in and just drop in darker values with my big brush. I'll be careful to leave my highlight areas alone though. I just soak up as much paint, then drop it into the areas that have the darkest shadows. I have to study his face first and examine where the darkest shadows are at. As you drop in these darker colors, it should immediately spread out if your paper is properly wet. I try to use my big brush for as long as I can before switching over to a smaller brush. Here I'm going back in and adding darker values on a dry layer. If your painting looks rough at first, don't worry, you'll be able to smooth it out. During this phase, it's important to keep an eye on your paper and to monitor how wet it is. As a new layer of paint dries, it starts to develop a dark, crusty outline. If you want those lines to be blended in smoothly, take a semi-wet brush and just run it along the line. Be careful about blotting the paper though, because at this point, if you blot the paper, it will lift up a lot of the pigment, so be very careful. This is a step that will be repeated many times throughout your painting, so if it's still wet, don't just walk away. Keep your eye on it. You can see that Johnny looks a little rough in the beginning phases, but at this point, I'm just more focused on getting the values in the right spots. This might be a stressful moment for some of you, because it does look so rough, but just know that if you keep things light, everything will be okay. Here, I'm just repeating the same steps, which is pretty much just reapplying the darker values. And then I also take my time to smooth out any crusty dark lines. So again guys, don't just let your paper sit there and dry without taking a look at it. I'm re-outlining some parts of the drawing in pencil because as I add on more paint, it becomes more difficult to see. Keep in mind as you paint, you won't be able to erase pencil lines, so I only draw on the darkest parts that I know won't be affected. It looks here that I'm just focusing on adding hints of red. If you look at his photo, there are red undertones around the dark shadows of his cheekbones. A big part of my method is just layering on values to create a darker value. Just like with our charcoal drawings from last year and my tree demo from this year, I'm not making the paints any darker. I'm just layering and layering and layering. There will come a point, however, when you start to have to get really aggressive with the dark values. That's when I switch over to a darker palette. There are a few mistakes that took me time to correct because of the camera being in the way. Usually I look at the painting straight on, but I'm at an angle so that my head doesn't hit the phone. But try to look at your painting straight on if you can. Because of my phone being in the way, I had to readjust his cheekbones several times. Here you can see me start to get more aggressive with darker colors. When I start to increase the darkness, the contrast begins to become more apparent, which gives the painting more light. Just like Bob Ross always says, gotta have opposites, dark and light and dark. Just like in life. What a great guy Bob Ross was. Painting for me is very relaxing. I know that there's no mistake that I cannot fix, and having that knowledge keeps me sane. It keeps the process enjoyable. It's important you guys understand this too. Here I'm starting to tackle the darkest parts of the painting like his eyes and eyebrows. Even though I know they'll be much darker, I warm up my brush control in my hand by going with a lighter color. This allows me to make any corrections or adjustments before committing to such a dark color. It also helps me to understand how I need to control my brush strokes. After I feel confident that I placed his eyes in the right area, I go back in with a much more darker color. I don't use pure black until the very end though, and only if I really need to. Just like with charcoal, save the darkest values for last.
Don't look around, here she comes now.
Yes, here I come now. Why shouldn't I come now? See here, let's settle this.
I do the same thing for his nose. I begin to outline it with a darker color, but again, I'm very wary about using black. You'll see later though, that I still have to make adjustments to his nose. I had a hard time trying to get his nose centered. It's important to take a photo of your painting and place it side by side to the original, just like we did with our self-portraits. After seeing my painting side by side to the photograph, I noticed a lot of mistakes, and so I make several adjustments. I realized my painting is much too light, so I add a layer of skin tone color on the entire painting. I later realized it's too dark and had to lift up a lot of the dark paint that I applied. That's one of the things that I have to be careful about. Watercolor dries much lighter, so when you're painting for a long time, your eyes can play tricks on you. You can see that I'm blotting his face pretty aggressively here. His face has a lot of warm colors like yellows, reds, oranges, so I do go in with a blue wash to cool down parts of his skin tone. It might be hard to see sometimes, but if you look at people's faces, you'll see a lot of different undertones like blues, greens, oranges. My art teachers always told me about this, but it was always really hard for me to see. With more experience though, it becomes a lot easier. Your observational skills are like a muscle. It just gets stronger and stronger the more that you use it. I also make sure that the white of his eyes are not pure white, and that's something that's really important to capture, especially when you're trying to capture a realistic looking eye. If you leave the eyes white, there's something about it that looks really unnatural. So take your time to study the shadows that are going on in the eye area. Towards the end, I'm making minor adjustments here and there, like darkening certain lines, reshaping his cheekbones, adjusting the chin area. I'm also adding highlights. With highlights, I'm going straight from the white and onto the painting, so it's a dry and wet process. And then finally and lastly, I work on the texture of the hair. I could leave the painting as it is, and it looks done to me, or I can spend more time on his hair to give it more texture, which I think I'll do later, but for now, it looks done to me.